and there was an image of a young guy with dirty blonde hair, and he was about to jump off some kind of ledge unspecified. And then a face came into the dream, and it was of a woman, a very beautiful woman. Maybe she was an angel or something along those lines, if you believe in those things. But anyway, it was a spiritual experience. And she said, "If you save him, you too shall live."
Hello and welcome to Passion Harvest. I am Luisa, your host. Thank you so much for joining me wherever you are in the world. I've got an amazing guest today, and I can't wait to share this interview with you. Dr. Stephen G. Post, a longer life, a happier life, a healthier life, above all, a life that matters, so that when you leave the world, you have changed it for the better. If science said you could have all of this by altering one behavior, would you? Dr. Stephen G. Post spreads the science of giving and the commitment to the greater good. Stephen is a bioethicist at Stony Brook University and an expert in compassionate care and the relationship between giving and happiness. He's the author of several books, including When Good Things Happen to Good People, Dignity for Deeply Forgetful People, and God and Love on Route 80. Stephen G. Post, welcome to Passion Harvest. I'm really so excited to have you on the show today. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Luisa. I couldn't be happier.
I just love all the work and the research you're doing and the messages that you share. And I'd like to talk about your books, but first I'd like to dive into a couple of things. And you're kind of one of the experts on this. What is the relationship between giving and happiness?
We are all deep down inside, evolutionarily and spiritually, givers. And so the fulfillment that comes to us and the inner peace that we feel when we give, importantly, with kindness, there's the sort of the external, almost emotionless kind of giving, the routinized giving. That's not as powerful, but kind giving is the core, and shifting your emotional centers away from the destructive emotions like bitterness and hostility and rumination. And when you give with kindness, all the neurology studies show that those neurological circuits that are the basis of these hostile, destructive emotions, they just get shut off. You can't have both turned on at the same time. And so the more you can cultivate kind giving, and giving is a great way to develop your kindness, the better off you will be. You will be happier and healthier, and odds are live a longer life, and you'll be more gratified.
And I just want to clarify, giving doesn't necessarily mean presence or monetary contributions. It can be time. I'll leave you to answer that. But
no, that's a great. I mean, so I speak about gift love, or love as the hub of giving, and I have an idea about love, which I picked up when I was a student at the University of Chicago many years ago. That when the happiness or the well-being and the security of another is as meaningful to you as your own, and sometimes more so, you love that person. And that holds whatever you're involved in doing, whether it's caring for a child or caring for an ill person in a hospice, or having a cup of coffee with an old friend who's had some hard times. Whatever the situation might be, maybe it's a clinician who's made a big medical mistake and can't live with herself. You can help people to understand that those who make no mistakes make nothing, and that we all are imperfect and flawed. So there's so many different expressions of love, And there's also just, the giving of a gift, or the helping somebody across the street. So all of these things are forms of giving. And in fact, studies show that even writing a check for a charity can be uplifting emotionally, and can help you with regard to happiness and the diminishing of depression. But the thing is, it's not just a writing of the check. The individuals have to have some sort of affective, sort of existential or gut level interest and commitment in what they're doing. So that's the same thing with the physicians. This is a big, huge hospital here at Stony Brook, and out just outside of New York. And the physicians who stay in touch with empathy and kindness in their interactions with patients have much longer and more successful careers. So it helps them not to get caught up in the kind of the routinization and all just the, treating the disease and not the person. So this is the center that I'm in. This is my office here. It's a large group of people. It's the Center for Medical Humanism, Compassionate Care, and Bioethics. Emphasis humanism and compassionate care, because that's really how people thrive. That's how these students were motivated to get into medicine to begin with. And so the more you can do to actually help them keep in touch with that inner being, the better off they will be. And they can navigate the difficulties of our world, because it is a harsh world right now. It's very polarized and, acrimonious, and there's not much forbearance or patience. And so this is how they can manage that and not be overwhelmed by it.
I mean, it's kind of obvious, but it's just wonderful that you've actually done this scientific research that proves these things, that kindness and goodness and helping others actually positively affects our health, happiness, and joy.
On the helping others thing, actually a little story. I came here from Cleveland, Ohio. You've probably not been to Cleveland. I'm guessing, although it's actually a wonderful city. And that was 15 years ago. And they recruited me here, and I had been 20 years in a suburb of Cleveland, and we raised our family there. And it was hard for me to make the move. So I felt a little bit out of sorts for a while. And I found that the best thing I could do was just, come into this medical school and think more intentionally about how I can be kind to people. And I use mirth, so if you look at why good things happen to good people, there's a section there on humor, because if you use, uplifting, generous, respectful humor, it can change people's attitudes in a millisecond. And it's just like that. And so even during the COVID period, I would come in here every day, and I'd see some people looking a little bit morose, and I started using call them dad jokes. What did the fish say when it swam into the wall? Damn. Or one of the ones I invented back then, I keep them in a notebook, because I believe in mirth. I believe that mirth is an expression of love and giving. It's a way of giving. Again, it can't be distasteful. It's not to say that people should be making disparaging comments about obese individuals within earshot of the door, which sometimes happens in medical settings. But no, everything has to be respectful and uplifting. But this is for the people who are philosophical and medical in your audience. Okay. So what do you do if you are an agnostic, if you have dyslexia and insomnia? Agnostic, dyslectic, insomnia.
No idea.
I'm not sure. You're up all night wondering about the existence of dog.
Okay.
Like, God, dog. That's the dyslexia part.
Right.
So just, I love mirth. And it's funny how, many spiritual people have a quality of mirth. They don't want to be overbearing. There's a kind of natural joy in their countenance. And people like Dostoevsky wrote The Idiot, sort of a book about kind of a Christ-like figure who has lots of humor and does things that are a little bit quirky, but it's all good.
And it makes people smile. It brings joy. Again, your book, and I just loved your phrase, "It's good to be good." I mean, it's beautiful. I just want to backtrack just briefly, because you do speak about your calling and synchronicities. How do you mind just sharing briefly with the audience, how did you get into this field of work?
Well, I'm going to keep this relatively brief, but
Okay.
I have to just tell the origin story of this. I was about 15 and I was in a prep school in Concord, New Hampshire, an Anglican place called St. Paul's School. And I had this remarkable sacred studies teacher, and we studied all the world religions. Later on in life, I would get to study with Joseph Campbell and all kinds of interesting people. But Rod Wells was our teacher there, and Episcopal priest. So I was a little different than most people there. They were off playing hockey. I was walking in the wooded paths, cherishing nature and reading scriptures from the world. I was peripatetic, I guess Aristotle would say. And that was my thing. So one morning, just after I'd kind of gotten up, but not quite, I had this interesting dream of a road heading toward the west. It was just totally mist enfolded, and so you couldn't see more than a couple of inches in front of you. And I looked to my left, and there was an image of a young guy with dirty blonde hair, and he was about to jump off some kind of ledge, unspecified. And then a face came into the dream, and it was of a woman, a very beautiful woman. Maybe she was an angel or something along those lines, if you believe in those things. But anyway, it was a spiritual experience. And she said, "If you save him, you too shall live. If you save him, you too shall live." And I had no idea what that meant, but I found out because a couple of years later, this dream recurred 5 times. I was out on the West Coast, headed to Reed College, where, by the way, Steve Jobs slept on my floor, just to say that. And we read the autobiography of a yogi and such things. But I was out in California for the summer at my cousin's house, and I drew a very, very bad draft number for the Vietnam War, and I just did not want to go over there and kill and burn women and children. So I called the people from Reed, who I turned down because I wasn't planning to go there. And I asked them, "Well, do you have a spot open for me?" They'd admitted me earlier on. And they said, "Yeah." So one very early September morning, I gathered with friends in front of the Nichiren Shosho Buddhist temple, where they chant Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. And I announced that I was leaving for Oregon. That's where Reed is, in Portland, Oregon. And an old Japanese American named Gus gave me a Gohonzon. That's a word for your audience. It's basically a scroll, and it's got some beautiful Japanese symbols. There's a heart with a line drawn through it, which means in Japanese, busy, no heart. It's interesting how those things get captured graphically. And oneness of mind and such things. So I took the bus up to the Golden Gate Park. I walked across the park, and I went across on the Golden Gate Bridge. And it was early in the morning, about 8 o'clock. And I really couldn't see more than a few inches in front of me. But I was on the left side. I got to the middle of the bridge. There's only one huge span there. And I heard some noise to my left, and I squinted, and I saw the outlines of a young guy who had dirty blonde hair, and he was looking like he was about to jump. And I stopped. I looked. I listened, and I said to him, I surely hope you're not planning to jump. And then he was so offended that I had interrupted this incredibly sacred moment for him. He just turned at me and he started spewing curses and even quoting Macbeth. I mean, he was not an uninteresting guy. His name was Harrison, I would find out. And I said, wait a minute, before you jump, let me tell you that when I was 15, 2 years ago, I was in New Hampshire, 3,000 miles away. And that was 2 years ago. And I had this dream, and I think you were in it. Someone who looked very much like you. And he just was shocked. And I said, and by the way, I told him how I got out there, and we carried on a very peaceful conversation. He calmed down when I told him about this story, and he was curious. He had a kind of gentle curiosity about how we could maybe be communicating between time and space, And so I said, if you come over here and step over the railing to where I am, I was on the pedestrian side. I mean, it's a long story. It's in the God and Love on Route 80 book. But I said, I'm gonna give you something that will change your life, going to change your luck forever. And he said, what's that? And he was kind of angry again. And I said, it's called a Gohon zone. And he said, well, what the hell? And he actually did walk over, and I unscrolled it and I explained some of the symbols to him, again, very quietly and in a peaceful tone. And he really settled down. And I said, look, I'm going to give this to you. And if you take this, your life will improve. And here's a note to my cousin George. My cousin George Lamont lived in the Mission District of San Francisco. He was a Vietnam vet. He lived on Chenery Street. And I'd been there that summer. And I said, George, this is Harrison. Please look after him. Bring him down to the Buddhist temple. Look after him and let him sleep on the floor where I was sleeping, and so forth. And so Harrison walked south on the bridge, and I walked north. And just as I was walking north, suddenly all the mist, and this had happened in the dream, all the mist evaporated. It was an incredibly radiant blue sky and sun. And I felt that I had experienced something that was pretty unusual, some kind of synchronicity, to use your word, that somehow or another we're more cherished in this universe than we realize, and that this was kind of set up, and it was a beautiful thing. And then I went up to Reed College, and I couldn't quite figure out what the second half of that statement, if you save him, you too shall live, meant, until in January. It was kind of rainy. It doesn't snow in Oregon, but it gets the rain freezes, and it gets very slippery. And I was in the coffee shop with a bunch of young people, and it's about 11 at night, and somebody burst through the door. We'd never seen him before. He says, my name's Andy, and I've got the fastest motorcycle in the world. It's a Harley Davidson Shovelhead. And that was the fastest bike at the time. And I never rode motorcycles, so I couldn't say no. He said, who wants to go for a ride? I said, I will. And so I went out and I got on this motorcycle, and he had, wild eyes and curly red hair and a black jacket on. And he just took off, and he hit 150 miles an hour in just less than a minute, went through every red light, every stop sign, went out to the Pacific Coast Highway, went for an hour toward California, and he hit 180, even 200 miles an hour. And the motorcycle was slip sliding all the way in the slush. And I thought I was dead. I really felt that was the end of it. And then lo and behold, with the rain beating in his face, he screamed aloud, and he did a U-turn over the midway. And I managed to stay on the bike, and he brought me back to the exact spot in front of the coffee house in the parking lot where he had picked me up. And now you have to understand, now it's 11 at night, and I was wobbly, and I'm barely managed to get off the bike, and I walked across this bridge to my dormitory, Ackerman dormitory. And I never picked up they had payphones in those days. They didn't have cell phones, they had payphones. I never picked it up, but I'd given the number to my mother. And so I walk across the threshold, and lo and behold, the payphone rings. And I actually felt pushed a little bit to pick it up, which was completely uncharacteristic of me. And I picked it up and I said, hello. And the voice was, hey, Stevie, you're alive. Thank God. It was my mother calling from New York. And she said she'd woken up in a dream and she had a premonition that I was dead. And she was sweating and nervous. And she just wanted to make sure I was okay. And I said, Mom, that's really interesting because you're 3,000 miles away. She was in New York, and somehow or another, in a mother's love, you picked up my situation, and that's not uncharacteristic of people's experiences. And so I became a real believer in synchronicity and in the idea that somehow our minds are much more connected, not just in some sort of biological sense, but in a spiritual sense, that our minds are gifts and that we all share in this one universal mind, and it can be the source of immense creativity and immense connectedness. So that's how I got started, and I've never veered from that. So having a calling, yeah, never veered from it. So yeah, so having a calling is having a feeling that somehow you're where you're supposed to be. I guess that's the simplest way of putting it. And I've always stayed close to that, and studied a lot of biology and a lot of science over the years, but ultimately went to the University of Chicago Divinity School to study world religions with Mircea Eliade, who had written a wonderful book called Shamanism, and Joseph Campbell was there half the year, and I had the opportunity to tell those great people about my stories on the Golden Gate Bridge, and I wrote essays about them, and they all were interested in synchronicity, and they knew it was real. So life is a journey, and the trick is follow your path. You can get knocked off your path because a little more prestige in that job, a little more money in that job, but the main thing is follow your path, and that is where a lot of your happiness will come from, because you'll see the coherency, the inner reason behind your existence and your your life and all of those things.
Gosh, what you explained that so beautifully. What powerful, incredible experiences, and studying with Joseph Campbell, what an honor, and who has the famous quote, "Follow your bliss."
Oh yeah. And when I wrote the God and Love on Route 80, I had some of Joseph Campbell's road metaphors in mind. Like, for example, you don't plan your life. If anybody who's listening today thinks that you clearly plan your life, that's an illusion. The bottom line, you might do some planning, and a lot of the medical students here are very plan oriented, but I've always followed my bliss, followed my journey. And that means that you're mainly interested in responding creatively and kindly and positively to the wonderful people that you encounter in an unexpected way. And not everything is synchronicity necessarily, but you'll have those moments when you just know that this particular person is here in answer to a prayer, if you want to put it in those terms. And Carl Jung wrote a book about synchronicity, and he spoke about uncaused with a capital U, uncaused causality with a capital C, and that's what we're talking about. That somehow, despite ourselves, I think people have to be understood. People do all kinds of not so great things in the course of their lives, but despite all that, we're still cherished enough that's the word, cherished enough, so that there's this mind of love and creativity and that is shaping some of our formation and interactions. I mean, the most dramatic example I had of synchronicity, even more so than not more so. The bridge was my origin story, But when I was at Case Western, and I taught at the medical school there for 20 years, and I did not want to leave, but the politics got strange and the money got difficult. So I took a job here in New York. And the night we left, we'd sold the house, and my wife and I have two kids. My son, who at that time was about 13, we were in a hotel around Case Western Reserve University, Glidden House, and it was about 11 or 12 at night, and I went outside with my old friend Tom, who was a lawyer in Cleveland, and he was saying, "We're so sorry you're leaving. Can you change it?" And I said, "I can't. I already sold the house and signed the contract." And I was having second thoughts, and lo and behold, again, it's very late at night, and out from the alleyway behind the hotel, there's a restaurant. It was called what was the name of that? The Peabody. So a fellow comes through the alley, and he's wearing a leather jacket, a suede leather jacket with lots of sort of stringy things and bells tied to the end. And he's African American, and he's very old, and he's got a stick with him, beautiful stick that I could even see in the distance, was very well carved and ornate and had all kinds of beautiful images, little faces and so forth. And he walked through the alleyway, and he came to the table where Tom and I were sitting. It was dark and there was no one around. And he said, I'm here because I had a dream that you would be here, and I wanted to give you my stick. And the picture of that stick is in the book, and I keep it in my office at home next to my chair. And he said, this stick knows where you're going, even if you don't. And he said,
that's amazing.
yeah, and he said, you can follow this any place. And he said, I'm giving it to you. And I said, but you must have worked hard on this. It's big. I mean, it's beautiful. And I said, can I give you some money? He said, $40. I didn't have my wallet, so Tom gave him $40. I paid Tom back later, but I still have that staff, if you will, and it's still very meaningful. So that's synchronicity, where somebody, that's an obvious synchronicity. Somebody in that kind of absolutely uncanny, unexpected way just sort of is right there perfectly at the perfect time with the perfect gift in the perfect place. And it's an amazing thing. So God and Love on Route 80 is really a collection of episodes of synchronicity over the course of at least much of a lifetime.
Yes, well, I was going to ask you about your books, and I really encourage the audience to check out that book and have a read of it. Just two questions. So Harrison, the guy on the bridge, I guess, as far as you know, he never jumped, and he went to your cousins.
Well, he went to George's, and this was George Lamont, and George was a really interesting guy. He was a graduate of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, had been to Vietnam, and was part of that subculture in the Bay Area. But he took care of Harrison, and I have to say, I had a gal friend that summer named Nancy. There used to be a Nancy in the story. I don't tell that in the book. And I had left her behind to go up to read. She didn't want to go to Oregon. And so Harrison and Nancy connected, and the two of them actually went back to his home state, which was North Carolina. And I don't stay in touch, but I know that they're okay. And so that was really impressive that somehow or another, I had been there on the bridge at just the right time. It was kind of like the guy who came through the alley with that staff at just the right time. I mean, I was feeling pretty low and like I'd made all the wrong decisions, you know.
It's just amazing, you know, the synchronicities. You are open to them as well, but you know, you spoke about time and space. You had dreams about this well before what we, you know, we describe as time. I mean, it's just incredible. For those, we spoke about following your bliss or passion, as this show's called, but for those that might, for the audience that might be feeling out of sync or not following their heart's calling, and they're in a funk, what's your advice?
You know, cherish nature, because I have to do that myself. You know, I get so caught up in the routines of day-to-day life, and sometimes I'm running on empty and I'm just going through the motions. I do get up in the morning about 5, did that this morning, and I have this old-fashioned book that keeps my schedule and I write names in it. So I know who I'm going to see over the course of the day, and I ask myself what expression of love would be the best one for this individual. Maybe it is forgiveness. Maybe someone did make a big medical mistake the other day and they can't quite live with themselves, or maybe somebody is really suffering because you know, their son overdosed, or something along those lines. Maybe somebody just needs a little mirth, you know, or they just need a little creativity, which is an expression of love. So I can give them some ideas about how they might conduct a project. So I'm always thinking about the people I'm going to encounter, and trying to envision or project a loving interaction. So it's not so much love that I think about as the modulations of love. The modulations are like spokes on the wheel, and love is the hub, you know. And so that's important, but nature is really key, because when you know, I'm sure some of your listeners, you know, they meditate and such things, and getting into nature is incredibly important. If you go to a little meditational center down the block, you'll typically find some wind chimes, and then you'll see a little stream of water flowing off a small rock, you know. You'll see plants and flowers. There's something about connecting with nature and realizing that nature is truly a gift. We actually held a conference at Linacre College, Oxford, in this past May, on the love of nature. And it was really great. I mean, we had all these wonderful, you know, psychologists and philosophers and theologians, you know, from Cambridge and all over. And it was wonderful. And it's not just, you know, the thing is not just ecology or, you know, saving the earth, quote unquote, but it really is, you know, can we love nature? Can we feel that nature is somehow a gift? And if you look, well, I'm sure all your listeners have read The Lord of the Flies. You know, Sam does well when he gets back to the Shire. You know, Frodo has to go off on that boat with Gandalf and the elves and sort of go wafting off, we don't know where. But Sam can reconnect with the Shire, and he marries that wonderful gal, and they have a couple of kids, and he's gardening all the time. He was a gardener. And you know, same, you know, if you read Voltaire, Candide, you know, for the French, you know, you know, at the end, after he's had all these big philosophies of life, he winds up gardening. So there are so many images in great literature of people who reconnected with themselves through connecting with nature. And that's what I recommend is, you know, meditation, but also spend a lot of time in nature. That's what I did as a kid, you know, at St. Paul's. I was, as I said, walking down these beautiful paths with big pine trees all around me, and And when I need to be inspired now, I take the ferry from Long Island to Bridgeport, Connecticut. It's about an hour and a half ride one way. It only costs $20 round trip. And there are the seagulls and the beautiful waves, and I'm not caught up in technology. So it's a refreshing nature is a gift to get back on your path. And so you garden, you mentioned that earlier.
Yes, we spoke before the show. I've got a very big garden.
Yeah. So what's I mean, it helps you, right? It helps you sort of reconnect with.
I don't know how I'd live without it. It's every time I look at it or look around, I'm blown away by the beauty of it.
Yes. Yeah. And so when you compare the beauty of nature, like the flowers over your right shoulder, when you compare that with the kind of craziness in our societies right now, the viciousness, the wanton harms that are ongoing, the acrimony, the expressions of hatred and fear and distrust, you could do a lot worse than have a nice garden. So I do think that nature is a way of reconnecting with our journeys, because it gives us a distance, and also just don't be tempted. If you feel like you're doing something that's meaningful, stick with it.
Good. Gosh, it's such a delight to speak to you. Stephen, where's the best place for people to connect with you or purchase your books?
Well, I have a personal website, Stephen with a PH, Stephen G post.com. But I also started an institute. This was complete synchronicity with Sir John Templeton in about 1999, and he named it. He'd written a little book. He was the investor who started the Templeton funds, and I'd known him for many years. They're now Franklin Templeton because he sold them to start his foundations, but he really wanted to study love, and so he faxed me. I was in Cleveland at the time. I remember the morning, the sun was shining, and I got a fax. He did not email. He was too old for emailing, but he thought the fax was the greatest thing ever invented. Okay. And he said we should start an institute to study the most important asset of human experience, which is love. And then I faxed back, Sir John, what should we call it? He said, the Institute for Research on Unlimited Love. Because he said, I don't want you to just study human love, but also the love that made humans and the love that underlies all of reality. He loved quantum physics and all of that. So I said in response, Sir John, maybe we should call it the Institute for Creative Altruism, because altruism is a nice dry concept. And he faxed back, no, I think unlimited love up to $8.9 million. And I faxed back, Sir John, I love that language. It jumps right off the page. So you can go to unlimitedloveinstitute.org.
I will leave a link in the show notes below for people just to click on it if they didn't get it. Just a couple more questions if you have time. Your work in hospice care, and particularly those with memory loss or Alzheimer's, I'd love you to share a little bit about that with the audience.
Yeah, well, so many people in your audience, we all try to manage that difficult part of life. So for about 30 years, I've been working with the deeply forgetful. And it just came out with a book last year, which has gotten a lot of attention in the US, called Dignity for Deeply Forgetful People. That includes me on the right day, by the way. How caregivers can meet the challenges of Alzheimer's disease. And it's really a tribute to caregivers and what kinds of attitudes they have that make their work successful and meaningful. So I don't like the word dementia because it's kind of like the word retard in structure. It's a negative term, and it invites, if you listen clinically, the negative metaphors like she's gone or he's absent, you know, and whatever. And he's a husk, he's a shell. But I never believe that anybody is quote unquote gone. They may have problems retrieving information, but underneath that, we can never say that somehow or another they're gone. And so this is a book in part about what now researchers are studying very significantly about paradoxical lucidity, about people with dementia who seem like they're gone, but then they can be stimulated through personalized music, through dance, through song, through art, through even smelling an apple pie that reminds them of grandma's when they were kids. You know, this can bring them back into themselves. And there's a wonderful website called musicandmemory.com. So this is now in Canada, for example, everybody who's diagnosed with dementia, whatever its cause might be, is given an iPod to listen to personalized music. And when they do that, they calm down. They use about half what would ordinarily be the prescribed medications in that period. It's not too long a period, but there's a period when they can become agitated and paranoid and so forth. But they use very little medication. They don't need it because by coming into these moments of stimulated lucidity, and they're not totally lucid, but they'll sing. You know, I'm a board member of the Brooklyn Memory Disorders Center, and they have Alzheimer's poets. Can you believe it? Who are and it's they're there full time, and so you'll have 30 or 40 people from Brooklyn come into this room and with their caregivers, and these are people who are really quite significantly affected. But if the poets read a poem that this cohort connects with, like Robert Frost's The Road Less Traveled or whatever it might be, lo and behold, most of them, even like 90% of them, will chime in for a word or a line, some for a whole verse, some will actually join in for the whole poem. And then after that, what's so interesting is that maybe 2/3 of them are actually somewhat conversant in a surprisingly new way. They're more conversant with their caregivers, and they have little moments of memory, and they can connect in ways that they weren't doing so before. So I think that there's no magic bullet for Alzheimer's. There's no drug that's making huge differences. Not even the most innovative new drugs. They're really not magic bullets. But how we interact and love the deeply forgetful, that's what makes all the difference. And so I talk a lot about, most people will talk about love for enemies, love your enemy. I don't have any enemies. What do I have? I have adversaries. And I love them because they bring out the best in me. Okay. So, but love for the deeply forgetful is a great challenge, and I think that's where we need to work on being totally inclusive of people with all kinds of cognitive conditions. So that's been my calling. Okay, that's a calling for me. It's been a calling since I was a kid at St. Paul's. I used to go to the Christian Science nursing home and play music for the old folks there. And I never had a sense that people were absent. There's a chapter in this book, Is Grandma Still There? And a question that grandchildren sometimes ask me, and I always say, of course.
Stephen, you are such an inspiration for me, really. This interview has been so incredible. I just thought you're like a human incarnation of an angel, really.
Oh, no.
What a beautiful person you are. On a final note, is there anything you would like to share with the Passion Harvest audience that I haven't asked you?
Yeah. Things have really changed. If you look back 20, 25, 30 years ago, studying this kind of topic and making it a scientific matter as well, was controversial. Uh, you know, I had many colleagues. I had a big genetics and Alzheimer's research grant when I was at Case Western. Many of my colleagues who didn't believe in anything about higher realities, they looked very much down on me for doing this and said it would ruin my career. But I didn't think so. And now, even coming here to Stony Brook, and starting a center for medical humanities, compassionate care, bioethics, there were people who thought the compassionate care part of that was completely over the top. But now, now you can go to Stanford or UC San Diego or many, many great universities, and you'll find centers for the study of compassionate care. And I think that's progress. That's what universities should be doing. They should be studying kindness and love in relationship to health and flourishing. And that's what we're seeing. It's coming along bit by bit. Okay, last story, 1 second story. When I got here, I remember that night, my wife and my son Drew, we got in from Cleveland. It's about a 9-hour drive, came over the George Washington Bridge out on the North Shore of Long Island here. And we stayed at the Three Village Inn, which is one of those old inns with a little bit of mildew where George Washington supposedly slept, maybe. And my son, who's 13, he just realized the penny dropped. He realized, oh my God, I'm getting texts from my friends back in Ohio, and they're wondering why wasn't I at soccer practice? So he was upset. And my wife was upset. It was the worst night of my life. So I said to them, I can't change this, but I can go out and get some pizza. So I went out in the car and I drove down the main drag of Stony Brook and the neighboring town. And I went to Little Joe's Pizzeria. Now, mind you, it's like raining cats and dogs, and the thunder is huge and the lightning is bright. And I walk across this parking lot and I get into Little Joe's Pizzeria. And in the foyer, there's a newspaper stand. This will amaze you. And there's only one newspaper on the stand, and I've never seen it. It's called the Three Village Herald.
Right.
And it's like all the little towns on the North Shore of Long Island. And there's only one headline on the front page. And it said, "Unlimited love comes to Stony Brook."
Oh, that's amazing.
I about keeled over because some reporter who I later met, she's a nice gal, she had even interviewed the dean of this medical school, who's a very well-known nephrologist, pediatric nephrologist, and the chair of my department. And they said, so are you sure this is the guy you want to hire? And to their great credit, they said, well, we think he can do this work. And if he has these interests, that's okay with us. So
yeah.
My first day of work, I called the president of the university who had recruited me, Shirley Kenny. And I asked her, Shirley, did you see that newspaper article? And she said, yeah, I did see it. And I said, well, what did you think? She said, well, it was okay. I got some phone calls. And I said, who called you? She said, emeritus professors, mostly male professors. And I said, well, what did they ask you? And she said, laughing, they asked me, what kind of love are we talking about?
Oh.
So
your unlimited love.
Yeah. And then I was in the middle of this building. There's an escalator, and I was taking the escalator from the second to the third floor. And there was this guy up at the top of the escalator who looked a little bit like a small Mr. Clean. He had his arms crossed, and he was kind of, he looked like he was in decent shape, and he was looking at me intently. And I was like, oh, I'm going up the escalator. It's my first time in the building. And I said to him as I get closer to the top, do I know you? Do I know you, sir? And he looked at me and he said, this is completely verbatim. He said, are you Dr. Post? This was a microbiologist, it turns out. He's a friend of mine now, And I said, yes, sir. And then he said, may I ask you a question? Are you going to save us?
Oh.
And I practically died. And I said, well, I got up to the top of the escalator and I said, well, I don't think so necessarily, but I'm happy to be here. And we had a nice, he was actually he's a good violinist, and I was a classical guitarist growing up. So we talked about Villalobos and such things, but it was interesting. And so there was that sense of, you know, on the journey, you know, you think of Joseph Campbell, there are going to be surprising moments where you run into little obstacles, but the obstacles they're not there to do ultimately damage. They're there to bring out your best. And how I responded to that fellow on the stairs, and you know, and I did bring the pizza home to my son and my wife, and they were okay, and we got a house, and life went on, and everyone's doing well. But you know, you have to be open to surprises and expand the canvas. I use that expression a lot. You have to, when there's a moment, and it's like a Jackson Pollock painting. You know, Pollock would put a big splash of pretty miserable looking paint down on the canvas on the floor, and it didn't look like anything. It had no particular aesthetic qualities. But by the time he covered it up with all those beautiful lines, energetic lines, it became a thing of beauty. So you're always, no matter what the difficulty anybody faces, even if they feel they're off their calling, they're struggling because of a loss or because of some mishap or something not so great, and life is full of that. You have to see that those moments are not final. They're not ultimate reality. The ultimate reality is how you expand the canvas. You know?
Yeah. Well, Pollock's a great example because unlike a figurative painter, he didn't know what the picture was going to turn out like.
No, no, no.
He didn't know what it was going to look like. He didn't have a photo of what he was painting. It's a perfect analogy.
Yeah, he didn't plan that stuff.
Like life.
Like life. I mean, he was a incredibly creative human being, but he did it in connection with this source of creativity, you know. And so, you know, when I get to England, I get to Cambridge University. I always go to Trinity College, which is one of the oldest ones, and there's a library there. And in the middle of the library is a glass case with the two notebooks of Ramanujan, the man who knew infinity. There's a movie done about him, the man who knew, and he was you know, mid-adolescent, and he had no particular mathematical prowess, and he would be, you know, meditating and praying at the foot of his goddess statue, and he would just receive these algorithms, and he wrote them down with his finger in the dirt next to him. And then he came back a little later and he would record them in these notebooks. And somebody got a hold of them, and they were so impressive. They sent them to Oxford, and the people at Oxford, Littleton, who was the most renowned mathematician at the turn of the century, he invited Ramanujan there, and Ramanujan went there and lived for a couple of years. But the problem was they kept insisting that he prove his theorems. And he thought that was completely unnecessary. And of course, they all turned out to be true, and they are pretty much the basis of quantum physics. And so that is a comment about the one mind. It's a comment about how sometimes, I mean, even Einstein would go into these meditational moments that he called Gedanke moments, where he would just, you know, he'd play a little violin to get started, and he'd look out at his garden, and then he would just go into these states of elevated consciousness, sometimes for an hour or so. And that's where he got a lot of his inspiration. So, you know, even Michael Faraday, I mean, his whole theory about wave functions and so forth, he was clear that he received that in a dream. So, you know, we can't think that our minds are just derived from tissue, from cells from an organ called the brain. When I was at Chicago, I had the honor of studying with a Nobel Prize laureate in neuroscience. His name was Sir John Eccles. He was actually from Sydney, from Australia originally, and then he went to Oxford, and then he went to Chicago. And I really loved Sir John. And that's not Sir John Templeton, that's Sir John Eccles. And Sir John Eccles, even though he discovered everything basically that we know about the connection between neurological cells, synapses, the idea of neurotransmitters, he created that, but he never believed that you could reduce mind to matter. He thought that mind preceded matter, and that if anything, matter is derived from mind, from some kind of original mind or one mind. And so that's what I believe, and I've known so many great philosophers. I mean, the person who wrote the foreword to God and Love on Route 80 is Larry Dossey, who's renowned for his one mind ideas. And so I think that when we elevate our awareness of the gift of the mind, by the way, Sir John Templeton, about 40 years ago, he wrote a letter to all of his investors, a Christmas note, and it said, "My Christmas note to you is this: are you aware that your mind is a gift?" God knows what they probably thought he was crazy, but he was a great investor.
Yeah.
And so mind is a mystery, and we can't reduce it to matter. And that's why when my mom called me that night at Reed College and the phone rang, that was mind at work, because it was more than her local mind. Deepak Chopra talks a lot about non-local mind. So this was the non-locality of mind. And it's when we understand that. I mean, I realize, the many great biologists say, well, we're connected as human beings because, my particular virology can affect yours, if I'm contagious or whatever it is, or, we're all dependent on the same food chains or whatever it might be. That's all true. But at a much deeper level, we are all one. And so when we love someone else, when we even do something heroic for them, but just are kind to them, we're also being kind to ourselves. And that's the secret.
Beautiful, beautiful, Stephen. Oh, thank you so much. And gosh, what a beautiful way to end the show, but everything, wonderful, wonderful. And thank you so much for the work you're doing in the world. It was a pleasure to have you on Passion Harvest.
Thank you very much, Luisa, and thank you to all of your listeners. And I wish you all the blessings in the universe.
Thank you so much. You too. Bye-bye.
Okay, see you. Take care.
If you like this episode, please do subscribe.